One of the most frequent attacks on the men's rights movement is the charge, the allegation, of anti-feminism. This allegation comes coupled with a straw man of what anti-feminism is in order to make anyone who admits to being anti-feminist feel made to look malicious. Of course, it needs your permission in order to work. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. It often starts with the argument that the movement is a knee-jerk reaction to feminism, led by men who fear losing their patriarchal power over women. These terrified patriarchs, our opponents argue, aren't fighting for men's rights, but to the detriment of women's rights. The men of the manosphere stand accused of striving to shove women back into the kitchen, take away our voting rights and our bodily autonomy, and normalize violence against us in order to maintain their control over all women everywhere. The women of the movement are accused of cooperating with this straw men's movement in order to have power and popularity over other women. In the minds of ill-informed grassroots feminists, their movement is about equality in a world where men have all the power and privilege, so there can be no other reason for a competing human rights movement for men except this malicious entity they so often describe. To the more venomous among their movement, the allegation is a bit of social chicanery. It's a neat trick from the relational aggression playbook. First, the aggressor briefly demonizes target A, anti-feminism, with nasty strawman descriptions and arguments. Then, she falsely accuses target B, the men's rights movement, of an association with her strawman of target A. The goal is to intimidate B into joining her in demonizing A while trying to distance themselves. This opens the door for her to smear B with the same strawman in response to their denials, because if you're afraid of the allegation, she can use it to make you cower before her. If she's really skilled, she can also get A to feel slighted or slandered by B, and fight back against B's responses, leading to a feud between the two targets. Playing into this by trying to placate the aggressor with denials that cater to her smears, or even with rational arguments, only results in further smear tactics. Any poop flinging that takes place does nothing but soil both targets. Meanwhile, the aggressor stands back and feigns innocence, completely shielded from the poop she stirred up, and rewarded with political conflict and distraction among her targets. So, let's tear into this straw man a bit. First, there is no back to the kitchen. It's bullshit. Historically, privileged women didn't have to work, but there have been hundreds of years of large segments of the female population working, with some even owning and running businesses, well before the word feminism was ever used to describe a political movement. Women are entrenched as part of the Western workforce, and changing that would lead to economic disaster that nobody wants. Even traditionalists aren't pushing for such society-wide change. To any rational thinker, it is obvious that the kitchen of feminist imagining does not exist and cannot be imposed on anybody. Nobody is trying to end women's suffrage either. Not only would such an effort be far more likely to destroy the public image of any group who tried it than to succeed, even if it did succeed, it wouldn't dramatically reduce women's political power. Society's gynocentrism places the majority of women's political power in the state of being a political interest demographic. A woman has one vote during an election, but an advocate in women's name can sway hundreds of thousands, even millions of votes, manipulate politicians and corporate administrators, and influence opinions beyond the scope of a single election. If women 100% across the board lost our voting rights, that power would still exist, controlled by the most prominent female victim signals from the loudest grifters. There would be little to no power among non-feminist women to counter it, because feminists pretty much have the existing political establishment under their control. With no benefit to the men's movement and such obvious damage to the power of rational women, such a plan is nothing more than a feminist campfire tale. No evidence exists for the men's movement's alleged opposition to women's bodily autonomy, either. Scratch the surface of that allegation, and you can usually reveal one of two forms: opposition to legal respect for the civil right of due process when a man faces an allegation of sexual violence, or demands that taxpayers be forced to fund the tools and services strictly used to facilitate women's sexual choices. Both arguments are less about bodily autonomy and more about power over men, either by imposing criminal punishment without solid proof of guilt or using the tax system to transfer financial resources from men to women in the name of women's reproductive rights. So, is the men's rights movement anti-feminist? No, and it doesn't have to be. But there are anti-feminists in the movement, and there's nothing wrong with that. Feminism is pretty anti-men's rights. We are a movement to address areas of disadvantage faced by men and boys. Among other things, that means promoting reform in law and policy to achieve equality where obligations and restrictions are imposed uniquely or nearly so on men and boys, or where benefits and protections are offered exclusively or nearly so to women and girls. When men or boys are disadvantaged by such conditions, that's a men's rights issue. An example is the issue of parents' rights. There is plenty of information showing the importance of ensuring, in most cases, that children maintain relationships with and are mentored by both parents. Failure to ensure this is harmful to the estranged parent and to children of both sexes. Mothers' rights are pretty well protected. Out-of-wedlock births start out in maternal custody, with the father having to fight for any parental rights at all. In divorce cases, maternal custody has been the default for over a century, with a slow evolution through joint custody that still favored the mother, then shared parenting that still favored the mother, to consideration of equally shared parenting rights in the dawning of the 21st century. In the United States, the National Organization for Women, the nation's biggest and most well-known feminist organization, fought against fathers' rights groups' advocacy for equal parenting rights every step of the way. Their opposition consisted mainly of wholesale demonizing fathers as deadbeats and abusers who only wanted to reduce their child support obligations. They opposed any legislative change in fathers' favor, with dire warnings that paternal custody rights would lead to children's deaths and mothers' financial ruin at the hands of stingy, violent, deadbeat dads. This they combined with lying about how equally shared parenting laws would work, to imply that no other options would exist if such bills were passed. Their approach has defeated several equally shared parenting bills in various parts of the U.S., causing it to take massive efforts and far longer than it should have to get this type of legislation considered, and significantly delaying getting any passed at all. Men's rights activists didn't seek a fight with feminists on this topic, but feminists certainly brought us one in response to advocacy for reform. As this and other similar evidence shows, it is not that the men's rights movement is by nature or ideology anti-feminist. We're not opposed to the standard feminists claim to uphold, that of equality for everyone. That is what we are fighting for: equality under the law, regardless of the sex of the citizen. If that were truly what feminism was also fighting for, our criticism of discriminatory law and policy would not pit us against feminist interests, but team us up with them. Feminism's response to men's rights activism exposes the feminist equality lie, showing the feminist movement for what it really is: a gynocentric approach to genderless human rights issues, one that treats women as uniquely victimized and uniquely deserving of consideration, compassion, protection, and provision, but treats men as uniquely privileged and malicious, uniquely deserving of condemnation, obligation, restriction, and imposition. Despite the claims of its grassroots, feminism's dogma excuses discriminating against men and boys for the purported benefit of women and girls, to the detriment of both sexes. I'm not telling you that the men's rights movement has to become an anti-feminist movement, or that you, in your activism, have to stand against anything you like about feminism. Just don't fall for their bullshit, either. Don't let critics of the men's rights movement pit you against critics of feminist prejudice and grifting, and don't let them use allegations of straw anti-feminism as a bludgeon with which to intimidate you. Call a lie, and a straw man, and move on. My response when faced with such allegations is to own them, When feminist organizations stop opposing equally shared parenting, due process in criminal court, and equal bodily autonomy rights for men, maybe I'll consider some of the movement's claims about its position on equality. Otherwise, hell yeah, I'm an anti-feminist, and there's not a reason in the world why I shouldn't be. This week, Judith Shar will join us on HBR Talk to examine the relationship between anti-feminism and men's rights, along with claims made by some feminists that MRAs are reactionary, misogynistic opponents of women's equality. The discussion streams on multiple platforms. You can tune in Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern or find other viewing or listening options on HoneyBadgerBrigade.com.